peaks of the Appalachian Mountains were shrouded in storm clouds, the kind that seemed to drink the sunlight from the sky. Rain fell in torrents, pelting the muddy, serpentine path that stretched endlessly through the wilderness. Lightning streaked across the heavens, briefly illuminating the silhouettes of tall pines swaying violently in the wind. A lone Jeep struggled against the storm, its headlights flickering as if the storm's malevolence were contagious. Inside, Claire gripped the wheel, her knuckles white with tension. Beside her, Ethan sat with his arms crossed, frowning at the rain-streaked window. "This can't be right," Claire muttered. Her voice, though firm, carried a thread of unease. "Relax," Ethan replied, pulling out his phone. "Let me check the GPS." "Oh, great. No signal." "Of course," Claire snapped. She hated feeling unprepared. How do we even let Jake talk us into this? A weekend in some backwoods cabin to reset? What is this, a horror movie cliche? Ethan chuckled dryly, though his laugh was hollow. He swore it was worth the drive. "Pristine views," he said. "Perfect isolation." He forgot to mention perfectly terrifying storm. They were both too proud to admit it outright, but tension had been simmering between them for months. This trip, a reluctant last-ditch effort to rekindle their fading friendship, already felt like a mistake. As they crested a rise, the cabin came into view, a dark, angular silhouette against the stormy backdrop. It stood alone, surrounded by trees, so ancient they seemed to lean protectively toward the structure. A single porch light flickered like a dying ember. Claire parked the Jeep and killed the engine. For a moment, silence filled the car, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. "Well," Ethan said, breaking the spell, "looks cozy." The cabin was indeed inviting, or it would have been if not for the uncanny stillness that surrounded it. The light spilling from the windows painted the porch in a warm glow, but there was something unsettling about how the shadows danced along the walls, as though the cabin itself were breathing. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin was meticulously maintained, its interior a blend of rustic charm and modern convenience. A roaring fire in the stone hearth cast flickering patterns across the walls, where old photographs hung in neat rows. Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair and whistled. Jake wasn't lying. "This place is nice." Claire nodded, though her eyes lingered on one of the photographs, a sepia-toned image of a family standing in front of the cabin. Their faces were blurred, not by age, but by deliberate scratches across the glass. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice low, "do you see this?" He turned, following her gaze. "Creepy. Probably just a prank. Rural art piece or something." Claire wasn't convinced, but she forced a laugh. "Sure, rural art." As they explored, unsettling details revealed themselves like fragments of a bad dream. The clocks, every room had one, ticked with an uneven cadence, as though struggling against the passage of time. A note scrawled in childlike handwriting was pinned to the fridge. "Don't leave after dark." By the time they finished unpacking, night had fallen. The storm continued unabated, its fury magnified by the isolation. The pair settled in the living room, Claire flipping through a book she wasn't reading, Ethan tuning the cabin's old radio. Static hissed from the speakers. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. "This is WXYZ Radio, broadcasting live, bringing you the latest news from 1952. Ethan frowned, twisting the dial. "Weird. Must be one of those retro stations." Claire wasn't listening. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. A whisper, so faint it could have been the wind, brushed her ear. "Don't leave after dark." She turned sharply, but the room was empty save for Ethan, who had given up on the radio. "You okay?" he asked, concern softening his tone. Claire hesitated. "Yeah, just tired. Get some sleep," Ethan said, standing and stretching. "I'll stay up for a bit. Make sure the storm doesn't do anything crazy." Claire nodded and retreated to one of the bedrooms. As she closed the door, she felt an inexplicable unease settle over her. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was stopped, its hands frozen at 11:59. In the living room, Ethan stared into the fire, his mind racing. He didn't want to admit it, but something about the cabin felt wrong. He told himself it was just nerves. But when the fire dimmed and the shadows deepened, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of footsteps above him. Ethan sat motionless, his ears straining against the relentless crackle of the dying fire. The sound of footsteps above was faint, but distinct, too deliberate to be the wind or the settling of old wood. "Claire," he called out, his voice trembling despite himself. The cabin swallowed his words, leaving only the storm's muffled roar outside. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from the mantel and began ascending the creaking staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, as if the wood were protesting his intrusion. The upstairs hall was shrouded in darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the old photographs on the walls. Ethan scanned the floorboards, searching for anything out of place. "Claire, is that you?" He tried again, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. One of the bedroom doors creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of blackness beyond. Ethan approached cautiously, his breath shallow. The air grew colder the closer he got, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. Pushing the door open with the tip of the flashlight, Ethan peered inside. The room was empty except for a large, ornate mirror propped against the far wall. Its surface reflected the faint glow of his flashlight, but something was off. Its reflection didn't quite match the room's reality. In the mirror, the bed was made, but the covers in the actual room were in disarray. The curtains in the mirror swayed gently as though caught in a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. "Ethan?" Claire's voice came from behind him, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What are you doing up here?" "I heard footsteps," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I thought it might be you." Claire glanced past him into the room. Her gaze locked on the mirror, and her face went pale. "That wasn't here before." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I checked the rooms earlier," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. This mirror wasn't here. The tension between them thickened as they both stared into the glass. The reflected version of the room seemed alive in a way the real one wasn't. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, like a pond disturbed by a stone. "Get out," a voice whispered, soft but insistent. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, dragging him back into the hall. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her chest heaving. "Okay, this place is officially freaking me out," she admitted, her usual composure slipping. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." They returned downstairs, but sleep was a distant dream. Ethan stayed on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, while Claire sat in a chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the storm. The hours crawled by, the storm raging outside. At one point, Claire noticed the clock above the mantel. Its hands spun wildly, like a wind-up toy released too quickly. "Ethan," she whispered, but before he could respond, the radio came to life again. "This is WXYZ Radio, broadcasting live. Tonight's top story: the mysterious disappearance of two hikers near the Ridgeview cabin in 1952. Authorities say time of death remains unclear." Ethan shot upright. "What the hell?" The fire flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to claw at the walls. The whispering returned, louder this time, a chorus of voices overlapping in a language neither of them recognized. Claire stood abruptly. "We can't stay here. Morning or not, we're leaving now." Ethan hesitated, but the fear in her eyes was enough to spur him into action. They threw on their rain gear, grabbed their bags, and headed for the door. It wouldn't budge. "What's wrong with it?" Claire asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Ethan growled, twisting the handle with all his strength. The door remained stubbornly locked. Suddenly, the cabin shook violently, as if something massive had slammed against its walls. The fire died, plunging the room into complete darkness. In the pitch black, Claire grabbed Ethan's arm. "The window!" They rushed to the nearest window, but as Ethan reached for the latch, his hand recoiled. It was ice cold, as though the glass were frozen solid. Then, In the darkness, a single phrase echoed through the room, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Time doesn't work here." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin for a split second. In that brief moment, Claire and Ethan saw them. Shadowy figures standing in the corners of the room, their forms humanoid but wrong. The light faded, and the cabin was silent once more. The air inside the cabin had grown impossibly still, thick with an oppressive weight that pressed against their chests. Ethan's flashlight beam flickered as he swept it across the room. Each darkened corner seemed to hold a shifting shadow, but the light revealed nothing solid. Claire gripped his arm. "We're not staying here another second," she hissed. "Agreed," Ethan replied, his voice strained. He turned toward the stairs, motioning for her to follow. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, her voice sharp with fear. "The back door in the kitchen," he said. "It might not be locked like the front." Claire hesitated, then nodded. Together, they crept through the darkened cabin. The storm outside raged on, the windows rattling with each gust of wind. As they approached the kitchen, the faint, metallic ticking of the wall clock grew louder, almost deafening. Ethan pushed the door open and froze. The kitchen was different. The wooden table that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by an ornate dining set that looked decades older. A faint smell of baked bread and lavender hung in the air, out of place in the damp, storm-soaked atmosphere. "Do you see this?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his hand tightening around the flashlight. "Something's messing with us." "Look," Claire said, pointing to the wall. The clock that had been ticking wildly was now perfectly still. Its hands were frozen at 3:15, though the second hand jerked as if trying to move forward but unable to. Claire's breath hitched as she noticed something else. The ticking sound hadn't stopped. "It's not the clock," she murmured. Ethan swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound. His breath caught in his throat. The ticking was coming from the floor. Claire stepped back, her foot hitting something soft. She glanced down and screamed. A trail of muddy footprints led into the kitchen from nowhere, stopping abruptly in front of the locked back door. Ethan spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly. "We need to." A low creak interrupted him, the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Both of them turned toward the dining table. One of the chairs, previously tucked neatly under the table, was now pulled out slightly, as though inviting someone to sit. The air grew colder still. Ethan felt the hair on his arms rise as a faint whisper tickled his ear. "See?" "Nope," Claire said sharply, grabbing Ethan's arm. "We're not playing whatever game this is." As they backed away from the table, a soft glow caught Ethan's attention. The radio on the counter, the one he hadn't touched since turning it off, flickered to life again. "This is WXYZ Radio, bringing you the latest news. A terrible storm has stranded 2 visitors at Ridgeview Cabin. Their fate remains unknown. Time of disappearance, 3:15 a.m. Ethan glanced at the clock. Its hands had begun to move again, painfully slow, each tick sounding like a hammer against his skull. "I'm done with this," Claire said, her voice hard. "We'll break a window if we have to. Let's go." They bolted from the kitchen, heading toward the living room. As they reached the window, a sudden crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. "Don't look back," Ethan said, his voice shaking. Claire nodded, her face pale. They reached the window and, without hesitation, Ethan grabbed a chair to smash it open. The moment he lifted it, however, the storm outside went silent. The howling wind, the drumming rain, even the occasional rumble of thunder, all of it vanished, leaving a vacuum of sound so absolute it made their ears ring. "What the hell?" Claire whispered. Ethan lowered the chair slowly, stepping closer to the window. Outside, the storm had vanished, replaced by an endless gray mist. The forest was gone, and the jeep that had brought them here was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the cabin seemed to be floating in a void, the mist swirling and alive. "No," Claire said, backing away. "No, this isn't possible." Ethan's mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason, but there was none. It's just some kind of trick. Maybe. A sharp knock interrupted him. It came from the front door. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and methodical. Ethan and Claire exchanged a terrified glance. "Don't answer it," Claire whispered. Another knock, louder this time. "Maybe it's Jake," Ethan said weakly, though he knew it wasn't. A third knock echoed through the cabin, shaking the very walls. The whisper returned, louder now, overlapping voices speaking in strange, fragmented tones. Claire clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with fear. The door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Beyond it was not the stormy night they had arrived in, but the dining room they had just left, its table now set with an elaborate feast. And in each chair sat a figure, their faces obscured by darkness, their heads turning slowly toward Ethan and Claire. The figures at the dining table moved with an eerie precision, their heads turning in perfect unison to face Claire and Ethan. Though their features were veiled in shadow, the faint outlines of their forms hinted at something grotesque. Elongated limbs, too many joints, and an unnatural stillness that was somehow worse than motion. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm. "Shut the door," she hissed, her voice trembling. Before Ethan could react, one of the figures rose. Its movement was deliberate, almost mechanical, as though each joint were being forced into place. A pale, skeletal hand reached forward, gripping the back of the chair it had just vacated. Then it spoke. "You're late," the voice rasped, brittle as dry leaves crushed underfoot. "What? What do you want?" Ethan stammered, stepping in front of Claire instinctively. The figure tilted its head, the motion jerky and unnatural. "You're the guests. We're leaving," Claire snapped, her voice stronger now, though her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on Ethan's arm. The figures at the table tilted their heads as one, the shadows obscuring their faces seeming to thicken, as if recoiling from the light. "There is no leaving," the figure said simply. Ethan's gaze darted to the window. The swirling mist outside seemed closer now, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The floor beneath his feet felt unsteady, as though the cabin were no longer anchored to anything solid. Claire tugged on his arm. "Ethan, we're leaving. Now!" He nodded, his throat too dry to respond. They turned and bolted for the staircase, ignoring the guttural whispers that filled the air as the figures at the table began to rise. The hallway upstairs stretched unnaturally, the walls warped and wavering like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Claire's breath came in sharp gasps as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadows were following them, flowing up the stairs like a tide of ink. "Where are we even going?" Claire asked, panic lacing her words. "The bedroom," Ethan said, his voice tight. "We can barricade ourselves, figure out what's going on." The door to the bedroom slammed shut behind them as Ethan shoved the dresser in front of it. The room was still, save for their ragged breathing. "Okay," Claire said, pacing. "Okay, we just need to think. What is this? Some kind of hallucination? A gas leak? We just need to stay calm." And the mirror on the far wall interrupted her, its surface rippling like water. "Oh, come on," Claire groaned, backing away from it. Ethan stepped in front of her, holding the flashlight up like a weapon. The reflection in the mirror was wrong again. This time it showed the two of them, but older. Ethan's hair was streaked with gray, his face hollow and gaunt. Claire's reflection was skeletal, her eyes sunken deep into shadowed sockets. "What the hell is this?" Ethan whispered. As they watched, the reflections turned toward them, moving independently of their real-world counterparts. Claire's reflection raised a bony hand, pointing toward the window. Ethan's reflection began to mouth a single word, over and over. "Jump," Claire said, reading the lips of the figure in the glass. "It's telling us to jump." "Not a chance," Ethan said, shaking his head. The reflections began to claw at the inside of the glass, their movements frantic. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mirror's surface, the sound like distant thunder. Suddenly, the whispers outside grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate climbing the stairs. "They're coming," Claire said, her voice breaking. Ethan turned toward the window. The mist outside churned violently, but he could just make out the faint outline of trees in the distance. We might not have a choice, he said. Claire shook her head. You're insane. That's not real out there. We don't even know if... The door to the bedroom shuddered violently as something slammed against it. We don't have time to argue, Ethan said, grabbing her arm. It's either this or whatever's out there. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting between the door and the window. Finally, she nodded. Ethan didn't wait. He smashed the window with a chair, shards of glass raining onto the floor. The mist surged into the room, cold and suffocating. Go! Ethan shouted, shoving Claire forward. The door splintered behind them as the dresser was shoved aside. Ethan turned to see the first figure step into the room, its shadowy form stretching toward them. With a final push, they leapt into the mist. For a moment, there was nothing but cold, weightless silence. Then, they hit the ground hard, rolling down a slope of wet grass and mud. Ethan groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, glancing around. They were in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, the cabin nowhere in sight. Claire, he said, turning to her. She was staring at something ahead of them, her face pale. Ethan followed her gaze. At the edge of the clearing stood the cabin, its windows glowing faintly. What? Ethan whispered. The front door creaked open, and the faint sound of laughter drifted out. The cabin loomed ahead of them, impossibly present despite their desperate leap into the mist. Its warped windows glowed faintly, the light inside pulsing like the breath of a sleeping beast. Claire staggered back, shaking her head. No, we left it behind. We jumped. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, his own face twisted with confusion and fear. Claire, focus. We're out here, not in there. Maybe this is just some trick, an illusion. Her eyes darted around the clearing. Look at it. It's the same cabin. We didn't get away. Ethan didn't have an answer. The ground beneath them felt solid, the cold bite of the air real. The forest stretched endlessly around them, dark and ancient, but the cabin stood unmoving at its edge, defying logic. A soft sound broke the silence, the tinkling of wind chimes, though there was no wind. We can't stay here, Ethan said finally, his voice strained. Claire nodded, wiping the rain and sweat from her face. Together, they turned and began walking toward the trees. The forest swallowed them quickly, its dense canopy filtering what little light remained. The further they went, the more the air grew stifling, the earthy scent of moss and decaying wood thick in their nostrils. How far do you think we've gone? Claire asked after what felt like hours. Ethan glanced back. The cabin was still visible through the trees, as though it had followed them. It's not possible, he muttered, his voice shaking. We'll just keep walking, Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll keep moving until... She stopped abruptly, her hand gripping Ethan's arm. Look, ahead of them. The forest floor was marked by a trail of footprints. Deep, fresh prints leading directly to where they stood. Ethan stepped closer, crouching to examine them. They're ours, he said grimly. We've been walking in circles. Claire's breathing quickened. No, that doesn't make any sense. We didn't turn around, Ethan. We didn't. The air seemed to press tighter around them, the oppressive stillness broken only by the distant sound of whispering. It was faint at first, but grew louder with every second, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of fragmented words and laughter. Claire covered her ears, her face twisted in fear. We're not safe out here. We have to do something. Ethan hesitated, then grabbed her hand. We go back to the cabin. What? Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. No, we just got out. We're not out. Ethan snapped. Look around. It's toying with us. If we keep walking, we'll just end up right where we started. We need to figure out what's happening, and the only place to do that is in there. Claire hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. But the whispering grew louder, echoing through the trees like a taunting chorus. Finally, she nodded, and they turned back toward the cabin. The structure looked no different than before, its weathered wooden planks and flickering windows as unsettling as ever. The front door stood open, revealing the faint glow of the fire inside. This is insane, Claire whispered as they stepped onto the porch. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "But what choice do we have?" They entered cautiously, the warm air inside a sharp contrast to the cold outside. The interior was just as they'd left it. The overturned chair near the shattered window, the broken glass on the floor, and the kitchen clock ticking away. Only now, the whispers were everywhere, swirling through the air like a living thing. "Time doesn't work here," Ethan muttered under his breath, recalling the voice they'd heard earlier. "Why us?" Claire said, her voice raw. "What does it want?" Before Ethan could respond, the radio crackled to life again. "This is WXYZ Radio, bringing you the latest news. 2 travelers have entered the cabin once more. Time of re-entry, 3:15 a.m. The clock on the wall stopped, its hands freezing at that exact time. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his composure fracturing. "This can't be real. It's like the cabin knows everything we're doing." Claire's gaze fell on the mirror in the corner of the living room. It was back, its surface pristine and shining. She approached it hesitantly, her reflection moving perfectly in sync this time. "Don't look," Ethan warned, but Claire didn't listen. She reached out and touched the glass. The surface rippled like water, and suddenly the room around them shifted. The cabin was gone, replaced by a vast void filled with swirling stars and fragments of their lives. Images of the Jeep, Claire's childhood bedroom, Ethan at his desk at work. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her hand trembling against the glass. "It's us," Ethan said, his voice filled with dread. "It's everything we've ever done, everything we've ever been." The whispering returned, louder now, forming words that chilled them both. "Stay. Be part of us. Time will hold you forever." Claire yanked her hand back, and the cabin snapped back into place around them. "What did you see?" Ethan asked, his voice desperate. "Everything," she whispered. "And nothing. It wants us to give up." Ethan clenched his fists. "Then we won't. We'll find a way out." But even as he said it, the shadows in the corners deepened, creeping toward them like ink spilled across the floor. The shadows crept closer, pooling at their feet like living tar. The air in the cabin grew thick and stifling, each breath a struggle. Claire clung to Ethan's arm, her voice trembling. "It's not going to let us go," she whispered. "Then we make it," Ethan said firmly, though fear flickered in his eyes. "There has to be a way to break this, whatever this is." The radio crackled again, static filling the room like a physical presence. This time, the voice was low and distorted, but unmistakably familiar. "Why do you resist?" it asked, the words stretching unnaturally, as if pulled from a great distance. Ethan stepped toward the radio, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "What do you want from us?" The voice chuckled, a hollow, echoing sound. "Time. All the time you have." "We're not staying here," Claire snapped, her fear boiling into anger. The shadows recoiled briefly, as though startled by her defiance, but then surged forward with renewed vigor. Ethan grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "We need to figure this out before it decides we don't have a choice." The two of them climbed the stairs, the shadows licking at their heels. The walls of the cabin seemed to warp and stretch as they ascended, the grain of the wood twisting into patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. When they reached the top, the hallway was longer than before, lined with doors that hadn't been there earlier. "This wasn't here before," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan nodded grimly. "It's changing, reacting to us." The first door on the left creaked open, revealing a faint light within. Against every instinct screaming at them to turn back, they stepped inside. The room was stark and empty except for a single object. A clock, its hands spinning backward at an unnatural speed. Its ticking echoed in their ears, each talk reverberating through their skulls. "What is this place?" Claire asked, staring at the clock as if hypnotized. Ethan approached cautiously. "Maybe it's trying to show us something." As he reached out to touch the clock, the ticking stopped abruptly. The room shuddered, and suddenly they were somewhere else entirely. They stood in the same cabin, but it was different. The fire in the hearth burned bright and warm, and the walls were adorned with cheerful decorations. Laughter echoed faintly from another room, the sound of a family celebrating. Claire and Ethan exchanged a wary glance. "What is this?" Claire whispered. Before Ethan could answer, they heard footsteps. A man and a woman stepped into the room, their faces warm and familiar. Too familiar. It was them, or at least a version of them. Older, more content. The older Ethan wrapped his arm around the older Claire, his voice filled with laughter. "It's perfect, isn't it? We've finally found where we belong." The real Claire stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "This isn't real," she said. "It can't be real." The older version of her turned, her expression soft but knowing. "Why fight it? You're free here. No pain, no fear. Just time to live as you want." Ethan shook his head. "This is a trick. It's trying to get us to stay." The scene around them wavered, the laughter fading like smoke. The fire died, the decorations crumbled to dust, and the room returned to its bleak, decayed state. The shadows seeped through the walls, forming twisted shapes that circled them. "Time flows differently here," the voice whispered again, rising from the walls, the floor, the very air. "You've already spent so much of it. Why not stay? Let us take the burden." Ethan turned to Claire, desperation in his eyes. "We need to make a choice. It's playing with us, feeding on us somehow. If we don't figure this out, we'll end up like them." Claire nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "We have to go back to the living room. Maybe there's something we missed." They ran from the room, the shadows surging after them like a flood. Downstairs, the living room seemed to shift as they entered, the walls bending inward, the fire in the hearth sputtering wildly. The mirror stood in the center of the room now, its surface glowing faintly. Claire froze. "The mirror. It's the key. It has to be." Ethan grabbed her hand. "Are you sure? What if it's another trap?" "We don't have time to doubt," she said. "It keeps showing us these visions. If we can face it, maybe we can break free." The shadows closed in, their whispered words growing louder, almost deafening. "Time will hold you," they chanted, their voices overlapping. "Time will consume you." Without another word, Claire stepped toward the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Slowly, she reached out. The moment her fingers touched the glass, the room exploded into light. The mist poured through the open door like an uninvited guest, cold and suffocating. The shadowy figures stepped forward in synchronized, deliberate motions, their elongated limbs bending unnaturally. Though their faces were shrouded in darkness, Claire and Ethan could feel their gaze, piercing, intrusive, and filled with intent. Ethan pulled Claire toward the fireplace, his hand shaking as he grabbed the iron poker from the hearth. "We can't just let this happen," he said through gritted teeth. "They're not real," Claire whispered, though her voice quivered with doubt. "They're part of the trap, just like the clocks, the mirrors, everything else." The figures stopped just inside the cabin, their forms flickering like the static of a broken screen. One raised its hand, long fingers pointing directly at Claire. "You broke the rule," it said, its voice fragmented and layered, as though 100 voices spoke in unison. "What rule?" Claire demanded, her voice tinged with panic. The figures stepped closer, and the room seemed to darken around it. "Time binds. Time punishes. Time traps. You cannot leave." Ethan swung the poker, the metal passing harmlessly through the figure. It didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, its head turned toward him in a slow, deliberate motion. "Your defiance will not save you," it said. "You will return to the cycle." Ethan stepped back, his breathing ragged. "What does it want from us?" The whispering returned, rising in volume until it was deafening. Words emerged from the chaos. "Surrender, accept, become." Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, her grip tight. "We can't let it control us. We have to find a way to break this." "How?" Ethan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Every time we think we're making progress, it resets. We're trapped." The figure closest to them raised both hands, and the cabin began to shift. The walls rippled like liquid, the fireplace flickering and distorting. The furniture disappeared, replaced by empty space and a growing sense of vertigo. "We're running out of time," Claire said. Ethan's gaze darted to the kitchen. The note on the fridge, "Don't leave after dark," echoed in his mind. He grabbed Claire and pulled her toward it. "We've been looking at this all wrong," he said. "What if it's not just a warning? What if it's a clue?" "What are you talking about?" Claire asked. Ethan pointed to the note. "Don't leave after dark. That's the rule we broke when we ran into the forest. What if the cabin's rules are the key to surviving?" Claire's eyes widened. "So, we have to stay here? Let this, whatever it is, take us?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We have to figure out the rules and follow them. Maybe that's the only way to break the cycle." The cabin shook violently, the shadowy figures advancing again. Their voices overlapped in a chilling chant. "Time rewinds. Time binds. Time consumes." Ethan grabbed a notebook from the counter and began scribbling frantically. "The rules. Don't leave after dark. Don't answer the door. Don't touch the mirrors. Anything else?" he asked, his voice rising over the cacophony of whispers. Claire's mind raced as she recalled their experiences. "The clocks," she said. "Something about the clocks. They only move when we, I don't know, acknowledge them?" Ethan scribbled. 4. Ignore the clocks. The cabin lurched again, and the figures closed the distance. One reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing Claire's shoulder. She flinched but felt nothing. No pain, no cold, just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. "Focus," Ethan shouted, grabbing her wrist. "What else have we seen? What else doesn't make sense?" Claire shook her head. "The radio. It always gives us warnings, but we keep ignoring it. Maybe it's not random." Ethan added another rule. 5. Listen to the radio. The chanting grew louder, the words twisting and looping into nonsense that drilled into their minds. The walls of the cabin began to collapse inward, the shadows consuming everything. "Write faster," Claire screamed. Ethan scrawled the last words with trembling hands. 6. Trust nothing but each other. As he finished, the shadows surged forward, enveloping them completely. The sensation was like falling through ice-cold water. The air ripped from their lungs as the world dissolved around them. Ethan woke with a jolt, gasping for air. He was on the couch in the cabin's living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The shadows were gone, the room undisturbed. "Claire," he called out, sitting up. She was by the window, staring out at the swirling mist. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes reflecting the faint light of the storm outside. "It's morning," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan glanced at the clock on the mantel. Its hands were spinning wildly again, and he realized with a sinking feeling that the cycle hadn't broken. "We're still here," he said grimly. Claire nodded. "But we know the rules now. If we follow them, maybe we'll find a way out." Ethan stood, holding the notebook tightly. "We have to stay sharp. Whatever's doing this, it'll keep trying to break us." As he spoke, the radio crackled to life. "This is WXYZ Radio, bringing you the latest. A terrible storm has trapped 2 travelers in Ridgeview Cabin. Their fate remains unclear. Time of broadcast, 3:15 a.m. Claire turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "We don't have much time." The whispers began again, faint at first but steadily growing louder. Ethan set his jaw. "Then we stick to the rules. No matter what." Claire nodded, her hand reaching for his. "We'll beat this. We have to." The shadows in the corners began to shift, watching, waiting. The cabin seemed unnaturally quiet after the radio's eerie broadcast, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Claire and Ethan stood in the living room, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. The shadows in the corners remained still, but they felt alive, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of their fear. "We can't just wait for something to happen," Claire said, gripping Ethan's arm. "What if sticking to the rules isn't enough? What if we're missing something?" Ethan glanced down at the notebook in his hand, his hastily scrawled list of rules staring back at him. "Then we need to test them," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We can't just react anymore. We need to take control." Claire hesitated, but then nodded. "Where do we start?" Ethan pointed to the radio. It's been warning us. Maybe it knows more than we think. They crossed the room cautiously, their steps echoing in the oppressive stillness. The radio sat on a small wooden table, its surface worn and cracked. As they approached, it crackled softly, a low hum emanating from its speakers. "Do we talk to it?" Claire asked uncertainly. Ethan shrugged, his hand hovering over the dial. "It's worth a shot." He twisted the knob slightly, and the static gave way to a faint, distorted voice. "This is WXYZ Radio, live from Ridgeview Cabin. 2 travelers remain trapped in time. To break the cycle, they must..." The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made both of them wince. "Damn it!" Ethan slammed his fist on the table. Claire grabbed his shoulder. "Wait, listen." The static faded into a faint melody, a haunting piano tune that sent chills down their spines. Over the music, a new voice spoke, soft and calm. "The key lies where the hands cannot move. The answer is found when the past meets the present." The radio went silent. "What does that mean?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed. Ethan's gaze darted to the mantel clock, its hands frozen at 3:15. "The clock," he said. "It's got to be the clock." They approached it cautiously, the clock's silent presence suddenly feeling ominous. Its glass face glinted in the firelight, and the words, "losing your mind," etched into its surface seemed to mock them. Ethan reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the glass. "Wait," Claire said sharply, pulling him back. "The rules. We can't interact with the clocks." "We have to," Ethan replied. "The radio said the key is here. If we don't figure this out, we're just going to reset again." Claire bit her lip, but nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful." Ethan lifted the clock from the mantel. It was heavier than it looked, the metal cold and unyielding. Turning it over, he found a small latch on the back. "Help me with this," he said, holding it out to Claire. She hesitated, then joined him, prying the latch open with her fingernails. The back panel popped off, revealing a compartment filled with gears that clicked and shifted as though alive. At the center was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Ethan unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, the ink smeared in places. "Time is not a circle. It is a trap. To escape, one must confront what binds them. At 3:15, the truth will reveal itself." "What binds us?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What does that even mean?" Ethan's mind raced. "It's talking about us. Our mistakes, our fears, everything we've been avoiding. That's why it keeps resetting. It's forcing us to face something." Claire's expression hardened. "Then let's face it." As if in response, the shadows in the corners began to move, flowing toward the center of the room. They coalesced into a single, towering form, its surface shifting like liquid smoke. "You are bound," the shadow intoned, its voice deep and resonant. "You will not leave until you are free." "What binds us?" Ethan shouted, stepping forward. "What do you want from us?" The shadow's form rippled, and images began to appear within its depths, fragments of memories. Ethan saw himself at his desk, ignoring his ringing phone as a missed call notification from his sister flashed on the screen. Claire saw herself walking away from an argument with her father, her face hard with anger as he called after her. The images shifted, growing more vivid, more painful. Ethan saw his sister's funeral, her name etched into the stone, guilt gnawing at his chest. Claire saw her father's empty hospital bed, a letter she'd never opened resting on the table beside it. "This is what binds you," the shadow said. "This is your prison." Tears streamed down Claire's face. "I don't understand. How do we fix it?" The shadow's form stretched, its edges blurring as it loomed over them. "You cannot fix what is broken. You must let it go." Ethan looked at Claire, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to let go." The shadow loomed over them, its dark tendrils curling and writhing as if alive. Images of their deepest regrets continued to flicker within its depths, their vividness a cruel reminder of the weight they carried. "Let go," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. How do we just let it go? Ethan stared at the shadow, his jaw clenched. We don't have a choice. If this is what's keeping us trapped, we have to face it. Claire shook her head. It's not that simple. I can't undo what I did. I can't take back what I said. That's the point, Ethan said, turning to her. His voice softened. We can't change the past, Claire, but we can stop letting it control us. The shadow's form shifted, and it spoke again, its voice resonating like a tolling bell. Face your truth. Release the burden, or remain forever. The room around them began to warp, the walls stretching and bending as if the cabin itself were alive. The fire in the hearth flared, its light flickering wildly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. Fine, you want me to face it? Here it is. The shadow twisted, and an image appeared, a memory from years ago. Ethan was seated at his desk, his phone ringing insistently. His sister's name flashed on the screen, but he ignored it, his focus fixed on the email he was drafting. I was too busy, Ethan said, his voice tight. Too focused on my career to answer her calls. And then she was gone. A car accident, and I never got to say goodbye. The shadow pulsed, the memory shifting to the funeral, where Ethan stood apart from his family, unable to meet their eyes. I've been carrying that guilt ever since, Ethan continued, his voice cracking. It's eaten away at me, but I can't change it. I can't bring her back. The shadow's tendrils reached toward him, but Ethan stood his ground. I'm done letting this control me, he said. I loved her. I failed her, but I can't keep punishing myself for something I can't change. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering. Claire watched, her breath shallow, before stepping forward. My turn, she said, her voice shaky but determined. The shadow twisted again, and another memory unfolded. Claire stood in her father's hospital room, her arms crossed as he tried to talk to her. His voice was weak, his words pleading, but she turned and walked away, her face hard with anger. I was so mad at him, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't there when I needed him, and I couldn't forgive him for it. Even when he was dying, I couldn't let go of my anger. The memory shifted to the hospital room after his death, the letter he'd written to her sitting unopened on the bedside table. I never read it, Claire said, tears streaming down her face. I was too afraid of what it might say, too afraid to face the fact that I'd wasted my last chance to make things right. She looked at the shadow, her hands trembling. But I can't keep running from it. I can't let it define me anymore. The shadow writhed, its form growing smaller as the memories began to fade. The cabin trembled, the fire surging one last time before extinguishing itself, plunging the room into darkness. You have faced your truths, the shadow said, its voice softer now. But there is one final question. Will you stay bound, or will you let go? Ethan reached for Claire's hand, squeezing it tightly. We let go, he said firmly. Claire nodded, her voice steady. We let go. The shadow shuddered violently, its form breaking apart into a swirl of black mist that was quickly swallowed by the room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and still. Then, faintly, the sound of the clock on the mantel began to tick. Ethan and Claire turned toward it. For the first time, its hands moved forward steady and even. The time read 6 a.m. The cabin's oppressive atmosphere lifted. The walls straightened. The fire reignited in the hearth, and the faint glow of dawn filtered through the windows. We did it, Claire whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. I think it's over. As they stepped outside, the mist was gone, replaced by the soft hues of morning light. The forest stretched out before them, alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. The cabin behind them stood silent and still, as if it had returned to being just another house in the woods. Claire turned to Ethan, a faint smile on her lips. Let's never do this again. Ethan chuckled, relief flooding his face. Agreed. Together, they walked toward the trail, the weight of their burdens finally lifted. The village at the base of the mountain looked different in the pale moonlight, as if the familiar buildings and winding streets had warped slightly in her absence. Rebecca staggered toward it, her boots crunching against the icy ground. Every step felt heavier, as though the mountain were trying to pull her back. The village was eerily silent. No dogs barked, no voices carried from the warmly lit windows. The few lanterns that flickered in the cold wind seemed dim, their glow failing to pierce the darkness. Rebecca reached the village square, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. She dropped her pack and slumped against a weathered bench, her breath fogging in the chill air. She was alive. She had made it. But as her heart rate slowed, unease began to creep in. The elder of the village emerged from the shadows, his hunched form wrapped in thick woolen robes. His face was obscured beneath the hood, but Rebecca recognized the carved staff he carried. The spirals etched into its surface mirrored those she had seen on the mountain. "You have returned," he said, his voice gravelly and distant. Rebecca nodded weakly. "I made it. The Guardians." Her voice faltered as she searched for the words. "They let me go." The elder tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "You do not understand." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked, her stomach tightening. "You are not free," he said. "The mountain does not simply release its prey. It spares you for a purpose." Rebecca's breath hitched. "I don't know. I survived. I escaped." The elder stepped closer, his staff tapping against the frozen ground. "Did you?" he asked, his tone heavy with meaning. The village began to shift around her. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and the faint hum that had followed her down the mountain returned. Rebecca's pulse quickened, and she scrambled to her feet. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising. The elder gestured toward the mountains. "You have been marked. You are part of the mountain now, and it is part of you. You carry it with you, wherever you go." Rebecca shook her head violently. "No, I'm done. I left. I survived." The elder's gaze didn't waver. "You cannot escape. The mountain always takes what it is owed." Rebecca backed away, her boots slipping on the icy ground. She turned and ran, the village blurring around her as she moved. The buildings warped and twisted, their shapes shifting impossibly. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating through her chest. She stumbled into the woods, the trees stretching unnaturally tall around her, their branches curling like claws. The path beneath her feet was the same one she had taken up the mountain, yet it seemed endless, looping back on itself. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You will return," they said. "You cannot leave." She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Her thoughts fractured and blurred, memories of the climb overlapping with fragments of her past. The faces of Luis, Eric, and Denise flickered in her mind, their voices mingling with the whispers of the Guardians. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the trail, the summit looming ahead. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't real." But the mountain's presence was undeniable. The cold bit into her skin, the mist swirled around her, and the path stretched onward. Rebecca stood slowly, her body trembling. She looked back, but the village was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of snow and rock. The mountain was all that remained. The whispers grew softer, almost soothing now. "You belong to us," they said. "You always have." Rebecca tightened her grip on her axe, her mind teetering on the edge of despair. She had fought so hard to escape, to survive. But now, standing on the frozen path once more, she realized the truth. The mountain was never something you left behind. It was something you carried with you forever. Rebecca took a deep breath and began to climb.